The alarm in Trauma Bay 1 didn't wake anyone at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center at 5:47 hours. Nobody at Landstuhl ever truly slept. Not the residents who learned to close their eyes standing up. Not the senior surgeons who kept one ear permanently tuned to the frequency of disaster. And certainly not the night shift nurses who moved through those fluorescent corridors like they were wading through their own exhaustion. The alarm was simply the next thing that happened, the way artillery becomes background noise after long enough. What did stop people was the sight of a woman they had never seen before, standing perfectly still in the middle of the briefing room, holding a clipboard she hadn't been given permission to hold. She was not remarkable in any obvious way. 5 feet 5 inches, slight build, dark hair pulled into a bun so precise it looked like it had been measured. No makeup, no jewelry. The hospital-issued scrubs she wore were the same shade of slate blue as everyone else's, and the name tag clipped to her chest read simply, Calloway, I-R-N. The only thing that didn't belong, and nobody noticed it yet, was the watch on her left wrist, matte black, military grade, with a face that displayed coordinates instead of decorative indices. A Garmin Tactics Delta, retail price, over $900, built for people who needed to know exactly where they were when everything around them was on fire. Nobody looked at the watch. They were too busy looking at Dr. Jasper Cole. He walked into the morning briefing the way he walked into every room at Landstuhl, like the architecture had been arranged specifically for his convenience. 53 years old, 22 of them in trauma surgery, with hands that had closed wounds in 3 combat zones, and a voice that carried the particular authority of someone who had never once been told he was wrong and believed this. He pulled the clipboard from Ivy Calloway's hands without a word of greeting, the way a person takes an umbrella from a coat rack, and flipped to her personnel file. His eyes moved down the page. They slowed at the bottom. Then he looked up. Darnall Army Community Hospital. He read the words like they were a punchline. Texas Pediatric Unit. He let a pause fill the room the way cold air fills a space, thoroughly, without asking permission. Do you know what we treat here, Nurse Calloway? Combat trauma, sir, she said. Her voice was flat as a horizon line. Combat trauma. He repeated it back to her with a slight upward inflection, the kind that technically isn't mockery, but functions identically. We receive the worst injuries produced by the worst places on Earth. Blast wounds, burns from IED fragmentation, traumatic amputations, multiple organ failure in patients who were healthy 24 hours ago. He closed the clipboard. We don't need someone who learned to take temperatures and change dressings for 8-year-olds. We need people who've seen what actually happens to a human body under modern combat conditions. 42 personnel were in that briefing room. Not a single one said anything. Ivy Calloway did not flinch. She did not break eye contact, and she did not look away. Her hands were loose at her sides, not balled, not gripping anything, and she stood with her feet shoulder-width apart in a posture that any career military person would have recognized as parade rest. Nobody in that room recognized it. They were all watching her face for the reaction they expected. Embarrassment or defensive argument, or the particular wilting that comes from being publicly reduced by someone with institutional power. She gave them none of it. Understood, sir, she said. Cole handed the clipboard to the nearest person and began the briefing. Nurse Holly Brennan, 26 years old, and 14 months into her first posting at Landstuhl, watched the new nurse from the second row. There was something about the way Calloway absorbed that opening volley, the way she received it and simply continued to exist inside it, that lodged itself in Holly's chest like a splinter. She leaned slightly toward the woman beside her and whispered, "Don't take it personally. He does that to everyone first week." Ivy Calloway turned her head a precise 2 inches. "I know," she said quietly. Then she turned back to the front. Holly didn't know what to make of that. She filed it away next to the watch she still hadn't noticed. The morning's first serious test arrived at 0914 hours, in the form of Nurse Floyd Barker, a broad-shouldered man of 41 who had spent 12 years as a medic with the 82nd Airborne before a knee injury redirected him into the hospital system. Floyd ran the overnight inventory with the discipline of a man who believed that misplaced supplies were a form of moral failure, and he had developed a very specific method for evaluating new staff. He handed them a clipboard and asked them to read the morphine administration protocol aloud for a trauma patient. It was a simple test. Read the protocol. Demonstrate basic competence. Move on. He gave the clipboard to Calloway outside room 4 and crossed his arms. She read the protocol. Intravenous morphine titration for acute trauma. Standard range of 2 to 4 milligrams per dose, with reassessment every 15 minutes. She read it without hesitation, her voice steady and precise, and Floyd was almost ready to be satisfied when she added, without looking up from the page, the standard protocol assumes a controlled environment, stable core temperature, and blood loss below 15% of total volume. If those conditions aren't met, the ceiling dose carries significant risk of respiratory depression. She looked up. In a fresh medevac case with environmental exposure, I'd push the floor down to 2 milligrams until we have a full picture. Floyd stared at her. That's not in the protocol, he said. No, she agreed. It isn't. She handed the clipboard back and walked toward room 4 to check the patient's IV line. Floyd stood in the hallway and watched her move, and there was something specific in the way she moved. Careful economy of motion, her back never fully turned to the open end of the corridor, that he couldn't immediately name, but that he recognized the way you recognize a song from childhood, partially, imprecisely, with the irritating certainty that you once knew all the words. He told himself it meant nothing. She'd read a textbook. People read textbooks. By 10:15 hours, the tension in the unit had developed the particular quality of bad weather, the kind you could feel in your joints before you could see in the sky. Doctor Amber Whitfield, who ran the unit's nursing coordination with the organizational efficiency of someone who considered chaos a personal insult, pulled together a brief assembly of senior nursing staff in the medication room. The new placement is performing outside her scope, Amber said, without preamble. She had the gift of making administrative language sound like prosecution. The incident with Dr. Cole's patient this morning, unsolicited procedural commentary, constitutes a documentation issue. I'm recommending a formal note in her file and restricted duties until her competency review is complete. Dr. Isaac Strand, the youngest attending physician, had wandered into the medication room looking for his coffee. He stood now holding an empty mug, listening. What was the commentary? He asked. She amended the morphine protocol verbally without authorization. Was she wrong? Amber turned to look at him with the measured patience of someone who considered the question irrelevant. That's not the point. It seems like it might be part of the point, Isaac said. Dr. Strand. The way she said his name managed to convey that she found his youth professionally inconvenient. We have a new placement with an undistinguished background who is performing outside her lane in a high-stakes trauma environment. Whether the content of her comments was technically accurate is a separate conversation from whether she has the standing to make them. Holly, who had been restocking shelves during this exchange, stared at the cabinet in front of her and said nothing. The splinter in her chest pressed a little deeper. The medevac came in at 11:03 hours. The alarm didn't build. It simply was, all at once, filling the hallway with structured urgency that separated the experienced staff from the newer ones in the way that a strong current separates strong swimmers from everyone else. The experienced ones moved before thinking. Their bodies knew the choreography. The newer ones thought, then moved. Ivy Calloway moved before thinking. It was a small thing, a fraction of a second. But Floyd Barker, coming around the corner with a crash cart, saw it, and it sat on top of the morphine protocol in the place in his mind where he was building something he hadn't yet named. 4 patients. 4. Marine Infantry, inbound from Forward Operating Base Lindsay in Kandahar Province. The worst of them was Sergeant Caleb Torres, 29 years old, SEAL team attached to a joint operation that the helicopter crew were not discussing in specifics. Left chest trauma from an IED detonation, suspected tension pneumothorax, oxygen saturation dropping. Dr. Cole took the case. He positioned his team with the precision of a man who had done this so many times that he had stopped noticing the individual people inside the process. And he assigned Ivy Calloway to the northeast corner of the bay with a single sentence. You stand there and observe. Do not touch the patient. She moved to the corner. She stood with her hands at her sota. And from that position, in the next 4 minutes, she watched the oxygen saturation on Torres's monitor drop from 92 to 87 to 79. And she watched Dr. Cole call for the intubation kit. And she watched his hands locate the laryngoscope with the slightly delayed certainty of a man finding a tool he uses regularly but not every day. Torres's chest stopped moving at 71%. The monitor alarm began. Cole had the laryngoscope positioned. His angle was wrong, a small error, the kind that a more current field trauma protocol would have accounted for. And in the moment of recalibration, the patient's oxygen curve continued south. Ivy Calloway stepped out of the corner. She did not announce herself. She did not ask. She moved to the head of the bed with 7 steps, her left hand open and extended for the laryngoscope before she arrived, and Cole, startled into yielding, gave it to her on reflex. Her right hand located the patient's jaw angle. Her left positioned the blade with the practiced certainty of muscle memory that doesn't require thought. The tube seated in 8 seconds. The chest rose. The monitor alarm quieted as the saturation curve reversed. 12 people in Trauma Bay 1 went completely still. Ivy Calloway stepped back from the head of the bed. She placed the laryngoscope on the instrument tray. She returned to the northeast corner. The silence lasted 4 full seconds before Cole found his voice. "What did you just do?" "What did—" His tone was not angry yet. It was something stranger than anger. It was the voice of a man who had just watched something happen that his mental framework did not have a category for. "The tube angle required adjustment," she said. "The patient's saturation was at 68 and falling. You performed an emergency intubation without—" "The patient needed a patent airway," she said. The same flat tone, no apology in it, no aggression either. Just the statement of a fact that had already happened. "He has one now." Torres's monitor held steady at 94%. The chest rose and fell with mechanical regularity. Dr. Amber Whitfield, who had come in with the medevac team, stepped forward. "You performed a procedure outside your scope of practice and your assigned role in this bay. I'm filing an incident report." She gestured toward the door with the finality of someone who had been waiting for exactly this. "You're out of this room. Now." Ivy Calloway looked at Amber Whitfield for a moment that lasted precisely long enough to be noticed. Then she walked out of Trauma Bay 1 without another word. Blake Mercer, the charge nurse who had worked at Landstuhl for 9 years and who prided himself on forming opinions slowly and changing them rarely, watched her go. He turned back to the monitor showing Torres's stable vitals. He thought about the 8 seconds. He thought about the angle of approach on the laryngoscope, which he had seen enough times to know had been precise in a way that required either extraordinary training or extraordinary experience. And in his estimation, those two things were not so different from each other. He did not say any of this aloud. He went back to work. In the hallway outside Trauma Bay 1, Mason Webb, 24, 11 months at Landstuhl, still in the phase of his career where everything left an impression, fell into step beside Ivy Calloway without intending to. He'd been restocking the supply cart near the door. He'd seen everything. "I thought that was—" he started. "I need the secondary IV supply for room 6, she said. Not unkind, just complete. He changed directions and went to get it. But he looked back once, and what he saw was her standing at the nursing station, updating Torres's post-procedure notes with the same unhurried efficiency she'd had since 5:30 a.m. Her handwriting was small and precise and slightly angular, the way writing gets when people spend a lot of time writing in low-light conditions with gloved hands. Mason didn't know that, but he wrote it down in the notebook he kept in his left pocket, under the heading he'd started that morning. "Things I don't understand about the new nurse. If you're just joining us, stay right there. This story is about to take a turn that nobody in that hospital could have predicted. A woman that everyone dismissed is carrying something none of them can see. Not yet." Before we go further, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment below. What do you think she's hiding? We read every single one. Now stay with us. The next 60 seconds will change everything. The incident report reached Colonel Richard Kingsley's desk at 12:40 hours. He read it with the unhurried attention of a man who had learned early in his career that the most important part of any document was often what it didn't say. The incident report said, nursing staff member I. Calloway performed an emergency intubation without clinical authorization during a trauma response, and provided unsolicited protocol commentary, inconsistent with her documented experience level. What the incident report did not say, because the person writing it had not thought to include it, was that the patient's oxygen saturation was at 68% and falling when the unsolicited intubation occurred, and was at 94% and stable within 10 seconds of its completion. Kingsley pulled the personnel file and found the seal he had not expected, a crimson border around the final 2 pages, a small printed notice reading, "Restricted Access." Level 4, clearance required, and a contact designation that he did not immediately recognize. He looked at the file for a long time. Then he looked up at the doorway to the corridor, as if he might see something useful there. He didn't. He closed the file and picked up his phone. Fiona Marsh had been stationed at Landstuhl for 6 weeks, transferred from a specialist position at Forward Operating Base Shindand in Helmand Province. And she had spent those 6 weeks finding the hospital's rhythms in the way that people who come from austere environments find the rhythms of comfortable ones, by noticing what was unnecessary. She had noticed a great many unnecessary things at Landstuhl. She had also, at 13:10 hours on this particular day, noticed something necessary. She had been coming around the corner of the East Corridor when she saw Ivy Calloway moving toward the nursing station with a medication tray. It was not what she was carrying or where she was going that stopped Fiona mid-step. It was the way she moved, her right shoulder closer to the wall than her left, her eye line moving in a specific arc that swept exits before it swept faces, her left foot adjusting slightly every time a door opened anywhere in the corridor. These were not habits formed in a hospital. Fiona knew what they were because she had them herself, and she'd acquired them in places where the consequences of not having them were permanent. She let Calloway move on without speaking, but she followed with her eyes, and she began paying attention in the particular way you pay attention when you've identified something that merits it. The second medevac case of the day was Aaron Briggs, 26, Marine Lance Corporal with a penetrating wound to the left thigh. The bleeding was controlled, the wound not immediately life-threatening, and Floyd Barker assigned Calloway to assist with the pressure dressing and tourniquet placement. She positioned the CAT tourniquet 2 inches above the wound margin, cinched the windlass to the tension required, and called out, 250 millimeters of mercury. Time of application, 13:42 hours. Floyd watched her hands. He'd applied 100 tourniquets. The motion was right. Not technically right the way you're right when you've learned a skill, but mechanically right, the way you're right when you've done something so many times, your hands know the end point before your brain has finished the instruction. "Where did you learn tourniquet application?" he asked. She smoothed the securing strap. "I've had good training." "That's not an answer. It's the one I have," she said pleasantly, and checked the patient's distal pulse. Floyd stood with the second tourniquet in his hands and looked at her for a moment that had weight in it. She didn't look back. She was recording the time, the pressure, the pulse, everything correct, everything in the order that the Tactical Combat Casualty Care Protocol specified, which was interesting because that protocol was not the standard hospital protocol, and he had not mentioned it, and she had not asked. He mentioned none of this to anyone. But in the hallway afterward, he stood still for a moment and looked at the middle distance, and the thing he'd been building in the back of his mind acquired a shape he still couldn't quite see. By 14:30 hours, the whisper network in the unit had generated its first official theory. It moved from person to person the way institutional rumors always do, through the spaces between tasks, in the 30 seconds of eye contact over a patient record, in the particular verbal shorthand of people who spend their days together and have developed a precise shared language for things they can't say out loud. The theory was CIA. It had originated, as best anyone could trace, with Blake Mercer, who had mentioned to no one in particular that the restricted access notation on Calloway's file was similar to a classification level he'd seen once on a visiting specialist from the Defense Intelligence Agency. And this had been picked up by 3 people who were not Blake, who had each added a small interpretive increment, and the result was a consensus that had the particular unearned confidence of a conclusion nobody had actually verified. The theory reached Colonel Kingsley at 14:55 hours, in the form of a suggestion from Dr. Cole, who said, "If she's an intelligence asset conducting some kind of internal review of this facility, the appropriate response is to keep her under observation, not to restrict her duties." Kingsley said, "I'll look into it." What he didn't say was that he'd been on hold with 3 different Washington extensions for 40 minutes, and that each transfer had ended not in a conversation, but in a different silence. A silence with texture, the kind that communicates that the question you've asked is one that someone above you has already decided you shouldn't be asking. He called one more number. The person who answered said, There is no Ivy Calloway in our personnel database. Then they hung up. Kingsley sat at his desk with the phone in his hand and looked at the restricted file, and did not know what to do with the fact that the most unsatisfying answer he'd received all day was also the clearest indication that something significant was happening in his hospital. Ivy Calloway was in room 4 when Fiona found her at 15:20 hours. She was changing a dressing on a post-operative patient with the efficiency of someone who had learned that time spent on a task is time not spent on the next task, and she was doing it without the particular chattiness that most hospital staff used to fill the silence in patient rooms. The patient didn't seem to mind. He was half asleep. The room was quiet. Fiona leaned against the doorframe. "F.O.B. Kandahar," she said. "You ever hear of it?" Ivy smoothed the final edge of the dressing. "I've heard the name. I was there. 2019 to 2021. Recon attachment." Fiona kept her voice conversational, informational. "You always keep your back wall side in a corridor." Ivy peeled off her gloves and dropped them in the appropriate receptacle. "Bad habit," she said. "Sure." Fiona watched her pick up the patient chart. "I picked up the same bad habit about 6 months into my first deployment." She paused. "Funny, the things that stick with you." Ivy signed the chart, replaced it in the holder, and looked at Fiona for a moment with an expression that was not quite neutral and not quite anything else. The expression of someone making a calculation that has more variables than are visible from the outside. Then she walked past her into the corridor. Fiona turned and watched her go. She was already pulling out her own phone. At 15:50 hours, Dr. Raymond Holloway, whose title was medical director and whose primary function in practice was to appear in doorways at the precise moment that would produce the maximum institutional weight, summoned Ivy Calloway to his office. She arrived at 15:57, sat in the chair across from his desk without being invited, placed her hands flat on her knees. Her back was straight, her expression attentive, and she gave every appearance of a woman who had been in rooms like this before and was entirely unconcerned by them. 5 minutes, Holloway said, to explain your actions this morning and this afternoon. My actions were consistent with patient care requirements, she said. Your actions were outside your assigned scope and your documented competency level. The patient's condition required immediate intervention. Holloway leaned back. He was 61, with the bearing of a man who had learned to use stillness as a demonstration of authority. I've reviewed your file. I've attempted to verify your credentials through the standard channels. I am encountering significant difficulty. He paused. You want to help me understand why that might be? The matters relevant to my assignment are not available at the security clearance level of this office, she said. It was not said rudely. It was not said with the triumphant satisfaction of someone deploying a trump card. It was said the way a mechanic might say that part needs to come from the factory, as a statement of fact about where the relevant information lived and who had access to it. Holloway looked at her for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and made a call. Agent Ethan Cross of the Criminal Investigation Division was 38, 6 feet tall, and had an expression of permanent professional skepticism that had served him well across 14 years of investigating fraud, impersonation, and the various creative ways that people found to be somewhere they weren't supposed to be. He arrived at Landstuhl at 1640 hours with a standard credential verification kit and the particular attitude of a man who expected to wrap this up before dinner. He sat across from Holloway, reviewed the incident summary, and said, Impersonation of medical personnel on a federal facility. We'll have an ID on her within the hour. Dr. Isaac Strand, who had been in and out of Holloway's office twice for unrelated reasons and had absorbed more of this conversation than anyone intended, walked into the corridor and found Fiona Marsh at the nursing station. The way she categorized the Torres case, he said, without preamble, the triage priority she assigned. That's not hospital triage. Fiona looked at him. It's the TCC algorithm, he said. Tactical combat casualty care. That's a field combat protocol. You'd only know to use it if... He stopped. If you'd used it in conditions where it was necessary, Fiona finished. Isaac put down the chart he was holding. He looked at the corridor where Calloway had last been visible. He was building something in his mind, and it had a shape that was uncomfortable, because the shape of it implied that something significant was happening, and that none of them were in possession of the information they needed to understand it. Who is she? He asked. I think, Fiona said carefully, that's exactly the right question. Ethan Cross had been at the database terminal for 40 minutes when he found the file. I, Calloway, RN Fort Campbell, Kentucky. He cross-referenced the service number, the certification dates, the post history. Everything matched the personnel file in Holloway's office. Everything except the photograph, which showed a different woman by approximately 30 pounds and 4 inches of height. He sat back. The file had been accessed recently. Whoever had built the cover identity had used a real person, a real nurse who had, it turned out, separated from service 18 months prior and was now working at a civilian hospital in Lexington. Someone had borrowed her record and adjusted the details just enough to pass a cursory check, but not a direct comparison. This meant one of two things. Either he had an impersonator who was sophisticated enough to construct a false identity with an existing record, or he had a cover identity that had been built by someone with access to military personnel databases. He reached the end of the accessible record and hit a wall. Access restricted, TS/SC. I authorization required. He requested access. The system denied it automatically, without routing the request to a human reviewer. That meant the denial was built in, programmed to prevent even the request from being logged in a visible queue. He stared at this for a moment. Then he picked up the phone and called the number that Calloway had given Holloway. Echo 79er. It rang twice. An automated voice said, "Authorization code required." He didn't have one. The line disconnected. He sat for another moment. Then he walked to Holloway's office and said, "I need her secured while we complete verification," Holloway said. "How secured?" Cross said, "Enough that she's not going anywhere." The order reached the floor at 17:22 hours. It was delivered by 2 facility security officers in the hallway outside room 4, in front of 11 people who were in various positions of movement or stillness, and all of whom went very still simultaneously when the cuffs came out. Holly Brennan was one of them. She watched it from 10 feet away and felt the splinter in her chest drive deeper until she wasn't sure anymore. Whether it was the injustice of the situation that hurt or the recognition that she'd stood in a room full of people all day, and none of them had done anything useful about what was happening to this woman. Ivy Calloway looked at the security officers without surprise. She extended her left wrist without being asked. The cuff went on. Standard restraint to the railing of the gurney being wheeled toward the recovery room, and she walked with it in the same posture she had walked with everything else today. Straight back, hands loose, eyes ahead, burning nothing. "This is a mistake," Holly said, and was surprised to hear her own voice. One of the security officers looked at her. "Ma'am, please step back." "It's all right," Ivy Calloway said, and the quiet certainty in those 3 words somehow made it worse rather than better, because it implied that she had anticipated this and had a reason to be undisturbed by it, and that the reason was not resignation. They walked her to the recovery room. The door closed. The corridor returned to its usual sounds: monitors, footsteps, the distant percussion of the hospital's permanent emergency, but with a quality beneath those sounds that Mason Webb, standing at the nursing station with a pen he'd forgotten he was holding, would later describe as the silence that happens right before something. He didn't know what the something was. He wrote it down anyway. Inside the recovery room, Sergeant Caleb Torres lay in the bed nearest the window, sedated but not deeply. His oxygen saturation was 94%. His chest moved with the steady reliability of a machine that had been correctly fixed. His eyes were closed, but not in the way of sleep, in the way of someone who is trying to hold on to consciousness while their body argues for the opposite. Ivy Calloway sat in the chair beside the door. Her cuffed left hand rested on the railing. Her right hand lay flat on her knee. She looked at the ceiling with the expression of someone who has learned to wait without it costing them anything. She had been waiting for approximately 4 minutes when Torres opened his eyes. He looked at the ceiling first, then at the window, then with the slow, deliberate rotation of a man moving a body that hurts, at the woman in the chair by the door. Something happened in his face. It was small, a compression of expression, a micro movement around the eyes. But it was not confusion, and it was not the morphine. It was the recognition that happens when you've been in the same dark places as another person. And both of you know it. "Commander," he said. The word came out barely above a breath, rough at the edges. Ivy Calloway turned her head and looked at him. Then she shook it. Once. Small. Deliberate. Torres looked at her for another moment. His eyes moved to the cuffed wrist. His jaw tightened slightly, which was all the reaction a man with his training permitted himself in a situation he couldn't control. Then he closed his eyes again and was quiet. In the hallway, Ethan Cross was at a database terminal for the third time in 2 hours and had just received the response that had drained the color from his face. Subject inquiry logged. Do not detain. Contact NSC immediately. He read it twice. National Security Council. The NSC didn't appear in a flag on a routine identity verification, unless the subject of the verification was in a category of personnel that the NSC considered its business, and the NSC considered very few things its business that were also within Ethan Cross's jurisdiction. He did not immediately report this to Holloway. He kept pulling the thread, because the thing about a thread is that once you've found it, you need to know what it connects to. He found a Navy record, partially visible through the search pathway he'd been authorized to use, with a photograph that had been redacted in every meaningful dimension except one: the edge of a wrist, a right wrist, with the lower portion of a tattoo visible, a numeral, and the lower third of a geometric symbol that he couldn't identify. He took a screenshot. He ran the symbol fragment through 3 different databases. The first 2 returned nothing. The third returned a single result, and then immediately returned an error message, which meant the database had recognized the query and decided he wasn't authorized to see the answer. He put the screenshot in his jacket pocket. He went to find Holloway. He told him, "I believe she may be a naval intelligence operative conducting an internal security review of this facility." Holloway looked at him. "So the answer is to keep her contained until we know more." "Yes," Cross said, because it was the only logical conclusion he could reach from where he was standing, which was, though he didn't know it yet, approximately 3 miles and 1 Belgian Malinois away from the right answer. "We're right at the halfway point, and if your jaw isn't on the floor yet, just wait. What's about to walk through that door will silence every single person in that trauma bay." Before the reveal hits, do us a favor. Like this video right now if you think Ivy deserves better than what they gave her today. Share it with someone who needs to see a real warrior get the recognition they earned. Don't go anywhere. It's coming. The recovery room at 1758 hours was quiet, with the particular quality of quiet that hospitals produce in the late afternoon. All the urgency of the day still present, but driven underground, like a river that runs under ice. Holly Brennan was in the corridor outside the door. She wasn't assigned there. She had simply found herself there after completing her last task and not moving away, the way water finds the lowest point of a surface without deciding to. She looked through the glass panel in the door. Calloway was sitting exactly as she'd been sitting 40 minutes ago. Straight, still, the cuffed wrist resting on the railing without tension in it. There was no resignation in her posture. There was something that Holly, after a moment, identified as readiness. The posture of someone who was simply present in a room, waiting for the next thing, certain that the next thing was coming and that it was manageable. Mason appeared beside her. He'd been making a circuit of the floor, and he stopped when he saw Holly standing at the glass. He looked through it. "If someone was actually impersonating a nurse," he said slowly, "would they be sitting like that?" Holly looked at him. "I mean," he said, "someone pretending to be here, someone who was scared. They wouldn't sit like that." He gestured vaguely at the precise stillness visible through the glass. "That's not scared. That's not even nervous." Holly thought about the intubation. She thought about the tourniquet. She thought about the way Calloway had received Cole's dismissal at 5:30 a.m. Not absorbed it, not deflected it, but received it the way a surface receives weather, without being altered by it. "No," she said, "it's not." Mason pulled out his notebook. He looked at the list of things he'd written down today that he didn't understand, and they suddenly looked different to him. Not like a list of anomalies, but like a list of evidence. He just didn't know what it was evidence of yet. Fiona Marsh, 2 corridors away, was on the phone. She spoke in a low voice, and the person on the other end was at a number she hadn't used in 11 months, but had memorized the way you memorize things that are important to memorize. She said, "I need you to run a name through the Tier 1 integration database. Calloway. First initial I. Posted to Landstuhl as of this morning." She listened. "I know the access level. I'm asking anyway." She listened longer. "You're sure?" It wasn't a question. She lowered the phone slowly and stood in the corridor with it in her hand, and with an expression on her face that was not surprise exactly, but was the confirmation of a thing she'd suspected so strongly, that the confirmation felt like proof of her own judgment, as much as proof of anything else. She put the phone in her pocket and walked toward the recovery room. Colonel Kingsley received the flag from Ethan Cross's inquiry at 1812 hours, not directly, but through the administrative back channel that the hospital security systems use to notify command of unusual database activity. The notification said, "Inquiry flagged at NSC level. Do not detain." He had received this notification 17 minutes after the detention order had been executed. He walked to the recovery room. He looked through the glass panel. He saw a woman sitting in a chair with a handcuff on her left wrist, and he stood in the corridor with his hands behind his back and a very specific expression on his face. The expression of a senior officer who has just understood that a significant error has occurred under his command and is calculating the dimensions of it. He did not go in yet. He went back to his office. He picked up the direct line. At 1827 hours, outside the main vehicle entrance on the south side of Landstuhl Regional Medical Center, a black military SUV came to a stop. The rear door opened, and the first thing out was not a person. The first thing out was a Belgian Malinois, 32 kilograms, coat of fawn and black, moving with the controlled urgency of an athlete who has been confined for too long and has just been given permission to work. The fur at his shoulders was marked with the red-brown of dried clay, and one of his front legs carried a bandage above the paw that he was choosing to ignore entirely. Around his neck was his standard tactical collar, but between his jaws, clenched with the careful precision of a dog trained to carry objects without damaging them, was something that did not belong to any standard equipment manifest. It was a commander's armband, navy blue, heavy-duty nylon, the kind issued to unit leaders in Naval Special Warfare Command. It bore a patch on the left side, a geometric insignia above the numeral 7, encircled by the words Ghost Unit. Below the patch, threaded through a loop in the fabric, was a medal that anyone with a background in American military history would have recognized immediately as a Navy Cross. The dog's name was Ranger. He cleared the SUV door and stood on the pavement for approximately 2 seconds, his nose moving in a complex arc, the systematic triangulation of a trained scent tracker fixing a location. Then he moved, not ran, moved with the specific, purposeful efficiency of a working dog who knows exactly where he's going and has no interest in anything else. He went through the main doors as they opened for a departing staff member. He moved down the first corridor at a pace that made personnel step aside. He ignored Dr. Cole, who came out of a doorway and said, "What the?" and stopped. He ignored Floyd Barker, who reached for him and missed. He ignored every doorway except the one at the end of the East Recovery Corridor, which was the one that stood between him and what he'd been sent to find. The door was closed. He sat in front of it. He made a single sound, not loud but carried, and looked at the glass panel. Mason saw him first. He made a sound that was not quite a word. Hawley turned. Through the glass, Ivy Calloway's head came up from its forward position and oriented with the precise speed of someone who has heard something they recognize. In the recovery room, Ranger sat and waited. This was what he'd been trained to do: find, deliver, wait. He had covered 412 kilometers in the last 31 hours by 3 different means of transport. He had a bandaged paw and 2 cracked ribs from a situation that would be in the classified incident report that nobody in this hospital would ever be authorized to read. None of these things were relevant to the task. The task was to deliver what was in his mouth to the person who owned it. The door opened. Ranger rose and walked in. He passed Holloway, who had arrived in the corridor. He passed Ethan Cross. He passed Colonel Kingsley, who had come from his office when someone, it was Mason, though nobody confirmed this later, had thought to call him. He passed every single person in that corridor, and he walked to the chair beside the door, where Ivy Calloway sat with her cuffed left wrist on the railing, and he put the armband down on the floor at her feet. Then he lay down, not beside her, not near her. At her feet, in the position, weight shifted to the haunches, chin dropped slightly, eyes forward, that a military working dog adopts when it has completed its mission and is awaiting instruction from its handler. The recovery room and the corridor and every person in them went absolutely quiet. Caleb Torres opened his eyes. He looked at the ceiling. Then, with the rotating effort of a man moving carefully through pain, he turned his head toward the door. He looked at Ranger. He looked at the armband on the floor. He looked at Ivy Calloway. His voice came out rough and low and precise. "That's Ranger. He's the K-9 combat partner of Ghost Unit 7. He paused. "He only does that for one person." The silence stretched for 3 full seconds. In that silence, the following things happened simultaneously. Holly's hand moved to her mouth. Mason took a step backward. Floyd Barker straightened his posture with the automatic correctness of a man whose body remembered 22 years of military protocol before his mind could weigh in. Ethan Cross reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone and looked at the screenshot of the wrist tattoo, and looked at the armband on the floor, and at the woman who had just been definitively located by a dog that had traveled 412 kilometers to find her. And Colonel Richard Kingsley, standing in the doorway of the recovery room in the early evening light of Landstuhl Regional Medical Center, looked at Ranger lying at the feet of the woman he'd had handcuffed to a gurney railing for the last 49 minutes, and did something that his body understood before his command authority could ratify the decision. He came to attention. His right hand rose to his temple in a full military salute. The salute held. Colonel Richard Kingsley's arm did not waver. His eyes did not move from the woman in the chair. And in the particular grammar of military bearing, where the body is a language and every position a sentence, a held salute is not a greeting. It is a statement. It is the physical acknowledgement that the person receiving it has earned something that cannot be summarized in a title or a file or an incident report, and that the person giving it understands this and is willing to stand in front of witnesses and say so with their body. Nobody in the recovery room moved for the duration of it. Ivy Calloway looked at Kingsley. She looked at his salute. She looked at Ranger, who had not shifted from his position at her feet, still patient, waiting with the absolute confidence of an animal that has completed its task correctly and knows it. She looked at the armband on the floor. The navy blue fabric had dust on it, and something darker at one corner that she didn't examine. She looked at it for 1 full second. Then she reached down with her right hand, the uncuffed one, and picked it up. She turned it over once, ran her thumb across the Ghost Unit 7 insignia. The metal of the Navy Cross was cold against her fingers, the way metal is cold when it's been traveling. Then she looked up at Kingsley and returned the salute with her right hand, clean and precise, and said, "At ease, Colonel." He lowered his arm. His posture didn't change, still straight, still correct, but something in it shifted from formal to something harder to name. Something closer to the expression a person wears when they've realized they've been operating without information they should have had. Behind him, in the corridor, the cluster of people who had followed him here: Holloway, Cross, Floyd, Holly, Mason, Blake, Isaac, Fiona, stood in a configuration that looked less like a group of medical and security personnel and more like people who had arrived at the edge of something and were trying to determine how far down it went. Dr. Jasper Cole was not among them. He had come down the corridor at the sound of the commotion and had gotten close enough to see Ranger, close enough to see the armband, close enough to watch Kingsley's salute, and had then stopped completely, one hand against the wall, clipboard in the other, with the particular expression of a man whose internal architecture is being renovated against his will and ahead of schedule. Ethan Cross looked at his phone. He looked at the screenshot of the partial wrist tattoo, the numeral and the lower portion of the geometric symbol he'd been unable to identify. He looked at the Ghost Unit 7 patch on the armband in Calloway's hand. He looked at her right wrist, where the cuff was not. He looked at her left wrist, where it was. He put his phone back in his pocket, reached into his jacket for the handcuff key, and walked into the recovery room. He did not announce himself. He did not explain. He inserted the key, turned it, and the cuff released from Ivy Calloway's left wrist, with a sound that in the silence of that room was louder than it had any right to be. She did not look at him. She did not say anything. She slid the armband onto her right wrist and fastened it with the practiced single-handed motion of someone who had done it thousands of times, and then she rested both hands in her lap and sat in the chair with the quiet completeness of someone who has been waiting for a room to catch up to her and has now given it permission to. The red mark on her left wrist, where the cuff had been for 49 minutes, was visible to everyone who looked. Floyd Barker looked at it. He looked at it for a long time, and something in his expression shifted in the way that a landscape shifts after a rain. Not dramatically, but fundamentally, in ways that change how the light falls on everything. Caleb Torres, in the bed by the window, had not closed his eyes again. He was watching with the calm attention of a man who knew the outcome of this story, and was simply watching it arrive at the pace it chose. His oxygen saturation held at 94%. His chart was correct. His airway was patent. The woman who had secured these facts was sitting 8 feet from him with a red mark on her wrist and a navy cross resting against her forearm. "Somebody," Torres said with the economy of a man rationing breath. "Want to get him water?" Everyone looked at him. "Ranger," he clarified. "He's been working." Holly moved before anyone else could. She found a stainless steel bowl from the supply cart in the corridor. It was intended for something else, and she did not particularly care. Filled it from the sink in room 3, and brought it into the recovery room without asking anyone's permission. She set it on the floor beside Ranger. He looked at her once, looked at Calloway, received no signal that suggested the bowl was not approved, and drank with the focused efficiency of a working animal doing necessary maintenance. Holly straightened up and looked at Ivy Calloway, and Calloway looked back at her, and the expression on Calloway's face in that moment was not gratitude exactly. It was something quieter than gratitude, the acknowledgement of a person who has been operating alone for a long time and has received an unexpected small kindness and is trying to decide what to do with it. "Thank you," Calloway said. It was, by Holly's later count, the 38th word Calloway had spoken to her all day. She had kept a count without intending to. The main entrance doors of Landstuhl Regional Medical Center opened at 1841 hours. The sound of them opening was not different from any other time the doors had opened today. The mechanism was the same. The pneumatic exhale was the same. What was different was what came through them, and the effect of that difference moved through the corridor in a wave that began at the entrance and reached the recovery room before the footsteps did. Vice Admiral Liam Porter was 61 years old, 4 stars, and moved through the corridor with the kind of command gravity that is not performed and cannot be imitated. The kind that accumulates over decades of decisions made in conditions where the wrong decision had permanent consequences. He was in full dress uniform. The stars on his collar caught the fluorescent light. Behind him walked 2 aides whose function was to exist in his vicinity in case he needed something, and who were currently redundant because the corridor was providing everything required. People stepped aside, not because they were told to, because the body makes certain decisions faster than the mind, and the body knows authority when it encounters it. Porter walked the length of the corridor at a pace that was neither hurried nor ceremonial. He passed Cole without looking at him. He passed the cluster of personnel at the recovery room door, and they separated without instruction. He stepped into the recovery room, and his eyes went first to Ranger, a brief acknowledgement, almost paternal, and then to Caleb Torres, who managed a slight nod from the bed, and then to Ivy Calloway, who had risen from the chair and was standing at attention with her hands at her sides and the Ghost Unit 7 armband on her right wrist, and who was looking at him with an expression that contained a great deal of information. He was the only person in the room equipped to read. Porter looked at her left wrist. The red mark from the cuff was clearly visible. His jaw tightened. It was a small movement. It lasted approximately 1 second and was controlled before it became expression. But the 2 aides behind him saw it, and Floyd Barker saw it, and Fiona, who had pushed into the recovery room doorway and was standing with her shoulder against the frame, saw it, and each of them understood it to mean something different, but all of them understood that it meant something. Porter turned. He turned in the specific way of a man who has made a decision and is now executing it, and he faced the assembled personnel in the doorway: Holloway, Cross, Kingsley, Floyd, Holly, Mason, Isaac, Blake, Fiona, and the corridor behind them, where more staff had gathered in the gravitational way that personnel gather when something significant is happening and they are uncertain whether to be present or absent. "Who issued the restraint order?" he said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Holloway stepped forward. He was a man accustomed to the authority of his position, and he held on to that authority, now the way a person holds a railing on a ship that is pitching in weather. "I authorize the security measure pending identity verification, Admiral. Under the circumstances, denying the restricted file, the unverifiable credentials, I had reasonable cause to believe—" "Enough," Porter said. 2 words. The kind of two words that have mass. Holloway stopped. Porter turned back to the room and he stood before the assembled personnel of Landstuhl Regional Medical Center's trauma unit and 41 people visible, and more beyond the radius of his voice. And he spoke with the deliberate clarity of a man who understands that what he says now will be carried out of this building in the memories of everyone present. Lieutenant Commander Ivy Calloway, he said each part of the name as a distinct unit, giving it its weight. Ghost Unit 7, Naval Special Warfare Command, Tier 1 Combat Medical Officer, 27 months at Kandahar Province, 11 months at Fallujah, Anbar Province. A pause. Navy Cross, Silver Star, 3 Purple Hearts. The recovery room received these words in silence. The Navy Cross is the second highest military decoration in the United States Navy. It is awarded for extraordinary heroism in combat against an armed enemy force. There were people in that corridor who had spent their careers in proximity to the military and had never been in the same room as a Navy Cross recipient. They were in the same room as one now. They had been in the same room as one since 5:30 a.m. Mason Webb, standing at the back of the corridor with his notebook in his hand, had stopped writing. He was not sure when he had stopped. He was looking at the list of things he'd written down today that he didn't understand, and he understood all of them now. And the understanding had a quality he'd never felt before. Not the clean satisfaction of a solved problem, but something rawer. Something that sat in his chest next to the recognition that he'd watched it happen all day and hadn't known what he was watching. Holly was looking at the red mark on Calloway's wrist. She was going to look at it in her memory for a long time afterward. She knew this with the certainty of someone who has witnessed a thing that will not release them. Jasper Cole was not in the room. He was in the corridor, at the outer edge of the gathered personnel, and he was holding his clipboard with both hands the way people hold things when their hands need something to do. His face had the specific blankness of a man who is processing a recalculation so fundamental that his expressions have gone offline while the work is completed. Dr. Amber Whitfield was 4 people away from Cole in the corridor, and she was looking at her phone. At 1844 hours, she had taken several photographs. She looked at those photographs now, and at the image they collectively formed, and she pressed her thumb against the screen and deleted them one by one with the quiet deliberateness of someone who has decided that certain evidence should not exist. She did not know that Mason had been at the nursing station at 9:14 that morning with a memory card in his left pocket that had its own record of the day. Floyd Barker had come to attention somewhere during Porter's recitation. He did not remember doing it. He was simply standing correctly, with his hands flat at his sides and his posture straight, because 22 years of muscle memory had recognized the context and responded accordingly. Ethan Cross was looking at the floor. He was a man of professional skepticism and long experience, and he was looking at the floor the way a person looks when they are conducting an honest inventory of what they got wrong, and finding the inventory longer than they'd expected. Porter looked at Calloway. She was still standing at attention, and there was in that posture, straight, clean, economical, the quality of someone who has been standing at attention in difficult rooms for a long time, and has made peace with what it requires of them. "Mission status?" he said. "Complete, Admiral," she said. "All required intelligence was gathered. The objective in the isolation ward has been secured." Porter nodded. It was a small nod, the nod of a man receiving information he expected, completing a transaction that had been in progress since before anyone else in the room knew there was a transaction. "At ease," he said. She shifted to parade rest. The armband settled against her wrist. Porter turned once more to the corridor. "This facility will receive a formal communication from Naval Special Warfare Command within 24 hours regarding appropriate protocol for personnel with restricted access designations." His eyes found Holloway. "Dr. Holloway, my office will be in contact." His eyes moved to Cross. "Agent Cross," then to Kingsley. "Colonel, a word." He walked out of the recovery room. Kingsley followed. The 2 aides followed Kingsley. The corridor, which had been a solid mass of bodies, parted again and then, slowly, without anyone announcing that the moment was over, began to move. Ranger lifted his head. He looked at Calloway. He looked at the door. She made a small sound. Not a word. Something lower. Something between a consonant and a breath, and he put his chin back on his paws. Isaac Strand was the last to leave the doorway. He stood there for a moment looking at the woman who had been a nurse this morning, and was something else entirely now, and then at Torres, who was looking at the ceiling with the expression of a man who is very tired and very glad to be alive. And then at Ranger, who was the calmest living thing in the building. He said nothing. He left. The corridor outside was loud in the specific way that corridors get loud after a silence. Everyone talking at once, the noise of people who have been holding their breath and have just been given permission to exhale. Holly and Mason stood outside the door and listened to it. And then Mason looked down at his notebook and said, "I have 47 things I wrote down today that I didn't understand." "Do you understand them now?" Holly asked. He thought about it. "I understand what they are," he said. "I don't understand how I missed them." "None of us did," she said. "She did," he said. He meant Fiona. Fiona, who was now standing at the end of the corridor, looking at her phone with an expression of quiet vindication that she was not sharing with anyone. The first consequence arrived before the door to the recovery room had finished closing behind Porter's aides. Dr. Raymond Holloway walked to his office, sat at his desk, and looked at the incident report that had initiated the events of the last 90 minutes. He read it with the particular attention of a man reading a document that is going to become evidence of something he would rather it not be evidence of. Then he put it in a folder. Then he put the folder in his filing cabinet. Then he sat with his hands flat on the desk and looked at the wall and conducted the kind of silent internal accounting that people conduct when they have reached the end of something. The formal inquiry would begin in 31 hours. It would concern the authorization of a restraint order against a personnel subject designated at a security clearance level above his authority to detain. The inquiry would be conducted by Naval Special Warfare Commands, in coordination with the facility's Inspector General's office, and it would produce in the end a document recommending that Dr. Holloway's role as medical director be reviewed pending the outcome of a broader facility assessment. His administrative privileges were suspended within the week. Dr. Isaac Strand received temporary authority of the medical director's functions, which he accepted with the visible discomfort of someone who knows they were right about something and finds no pleasure in being right about it. This was the first layer, the layer visible to everyone who'd been in the corridor. The second layer was less visible and more personal. Ethan Cross filed his report at 19:20 hours, sitting in a hospital conference room with a coffee he hadn't touched, writing with the specific, careful honesty of a professional who knows the report will be reviewed by people who are better at this than he is, and who will notice if he softens anything. He wrote that the NSC flag had appeared in his search results at 17:55 hours. He wrote that he had been aware of it before communicating the recommendation to detain. He wrote that his subsequent assessment had been incorrect, that he had pursued a theory, intelligence operative conducting internal security review, that was not supported by the evidence available, and that the evidence available had in fact pointed in a different direction that he had not adequately weighed. He wrote all of this with the professional composure of a man absorbing a significant error without collapsing under it. It was not easy. It was necessary. He submitted the report, and then he sat with the empty coffee cup for a while, and then he called his supervisor and said, "I need a debrief. I got something wrong today, and I need to talk through how." His supervisor said, "Okay." The fact that he said it without surprise was not comforting. It was informative. The third layer moved through the facility at a speed that institutional changes rarely achieve. Quickly, because the people affected by it were already assembled in the same building and already aware of the events that had precipitated it. Colonel Kingsley met with Porter for 22 minutes in an office that was temporarily commandeered from its usual occupant. The conversation was not recorded. What emerged from it, communicated to the appropriate staff through the appropriate channels before 1900 hours, was a directive. Personnel presenting credentials with Level 4 access restrictions would, from this point forward, be processed through a dedicated verification channel with a maximum response time of 15 minutes. The channel existed. It had always existed. It had simply not been integrated into the facility's standard onboarding protocol, because no one had anticipated that it would be needed. It existed, Kingsley said afterward, in a tone that was its own indictment. We just didn't use it. He submitted the procedural revision to the relevant oversight body the same night. He submitted it himself, not through an aide, and he submitted it at 22:14 hours, which meant he'd been working on it since leaving Porter's borrowed office, which meant it hadn't waited until morning, which was the kind of detail that people noticed. The fourth layer was the one that couldn't be documented. Mason Webb stood at the nursing station at 19:15 hours, and wrote at the top of a clean page in his notebook, "What I saw today." He wrote for 45 minutes without stopping. He wrote the tourniquet, he wrote the intubation, he wrote the morphine protocol, he wrote the way she moved down corridors, he wrote the watch, he wrote the 49 minutes of the cuff, and the red mark and Ranger walking past everyone else to reach her feet. He wrote Porter's list of honors, which he had memorized by the time Porter finished speaking, and could reproduce in order without checking a source. He wrote all 47 entries from his earlier list and added, after each one, what he now understood them to be. When he was done, he looked at what he'd written. Then he tore it carefully from the notebook, folded it, and went down the corridor and through the door into the recovery room. Calloway was standing at the window. Ranger was still on the floor. Torres appeared to be sleeping, though his vital signs showed the lighter register of a man who is resting rather than unconscious. The room had the quality of aftermath, the stillness that follows something significant when the significant thing has passed, but its shape is still visible in the air. Mason stood just inside the door. He was holding the folded paper. He was 24 years old and 11 months into his first real professional posting, and he had been in this building since 5:45 a.m. And he was tired in the specific way that people are tired when a day has required them to be many different versions of themselves. "Commander Calloway," he said. She turned from the window. He held out the paper. "I wrote down everything," he said, "from today. I wanted you to know that I was paying attention, that someone was paying attention." She looked at him. The expression on her face did the small, complicated thing it had done that morning, when Holly brought the water bowl for Ranger. Not quite gratitude, something adjacent to it, something that included within it the acknowledgement of an unexpected thing. She crossed the room and took the paper. She unfolded it. She read it. Not quickly, not skimming, but reading the way you read something that was written carefully. And when she was done, she refolded it with the same precision she brought to everything else. "How do you make sure someone doesn't have to prove who they are in order to be treated with basic respect?" he asked. He wasn't sure where the question came from. It had been building since approximately 10 a.m. She looked at him for a moment in the way she had looked at him periodically throughout the day. The evaluative look, the look that took a genuine measure of what was in front of it. "You just asked the right question," she said. He waited for more. There was no more. She turned back to the window. He stood there for another moment. Then he nodded at Ranger, who didn't acknowledge him but whose tail moved once, slightly, in what Mason chose to interpret as communication. Then he went back to the corridor and stood in it, and thought about the question he'd asked and the answer he'd received, and he thought about it for the rest of the shift, and for several days afterward. And it changed the way he did his job in ways that were small and consistent and impossible to point to individually, but were visible in aggregate to anyone who knew what to look for. Floyd Barker found Calloway in the corridor at 1940 hours. She was coming from the supply room with a small kit. She had not, apparently, considered the evening's events a sufficient reason to leave before the end of her assigned shift. He fell into step beside her without planning to, the way he'd done things all day without planning them. "The morphine protocol this morning," he said. "Yes, you were right about the field conditions." "I know," she said. Not unkindly. "I tested you," he said. "The tourniquet, the protocol. I was looking for the error. I know that too." He walked 3 more steps beside her. "You passed things I wouldn't have passed if I didn't know they were tests," he said. "And you didn't know they were tests." "I knew," she said. He looked at her. "They're always tests," she said. "Every environment, every person you work with, every task in a new place." She shifted the kit to her other hand. "The question isn't whether you're being evaluated. The question is whether the thing you know is real enough to hold up when it's tested by someone who doesn't know you." Floyd processed this for a moment. They reached the nursing station. He stopped. "I should have," he started. "You did what made sense with the information you had," she said. "That's all any of us can do." She set the kit on the counter. She looked at him directly, and it was the first time all day that the look she gave him didn't contain any calculation, just the simple, even regard of one professional for another. "Your instincts weren't wrong. You knew something was off. You just didn't know which direction the off was coming from." Floyd held that for a moment. Then he nodded once, the specific nod of a man who has received something and intends to keep it. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'd want you in the room if it went wrong." She picked up the kit. "I'll take that," she said, and walked away. He watched her go, and the thing he'd been building in his mind all day finally had a shape he could name. It was respect, accumulated piece by piece since 9:14 a.m., and it sat in him now with the weight and solidity of a thing that had been earned rather than given. The conversation between Jasper Cole and Ivy Calloway happened at 20:06 hours in the East Corridor, without an audience. Cole had been waiting, not obviously. He'd been doing the things a person does when they were waiting without wanting to appear to be waiting. Reviewing charts he'd already reviewed, making phone calls of secondary importance. But the corridor was not large, and Landstuhl was not a place that permitted sustained avoidance of anything for long. She came around the corner from the supply room with a report form in her hand and stopped 3 feet away from him. He was standing against the wall. He had left his clipboard somewhere. It was the first time today she'd seen him without it. And he looked, without it, slightly smaller than he had this morning, which was not a physical observation. He straightened. He looked at her. And then Dr. Jasper Cole, senior trauma surgeon, 22 years of experience across 3 combat zones, the man who had handed her clipboard back to her at 5:40 a.m., as though it were a returned library book, did something that everyone who witnessed Porter's salute had done before they understood it. His body made a decision ahead of his authority, and he inclined his head. Not a bow, not a salute. Something between them in the grammar of a man who has been trained in a form of respect that doesn't translate precisely to military protocol, but is reaching for it anyway. She watched him do it. "Dr. Cole," she said. "Commander," he said. A pause. The corridor made its sounds around them. A distant monitor, footsteps on the floor above. "The patient this morning," he said. "Torres, the intubation." "Yes, I was going to correct the angle," he said. She waited. "I was going to get there," he said, and there was in these words something she recognized as the particular courage of a person making an honest accounting without softening it into a more comfortable version. He wasn't saying he would have gotten there in time. He was saying he would have gotten there. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "That doesn't make it—" "You've closed wounds in 3 combat zones," she said. "You know what the stakes are in this room. You built something real here." She held his eyes. "The problem this morning wasn't who you are. It was that you made an assessment in 30 seconds that required 30 years to be equipped to contradict." A pause. "I've spent those 30 years differently than you have. That's not a competition." Cole looked at her for a moment that had more in it than the previous 11 hours combined. Then he nodded. A different nod from the one he'd led with. More settled, more direct. He picked up the clipboard that had been leaning against the wall beside him, and he walked back the way he'd come. Fiona was at the end of the corridor. She had not been trying to witness the exchange. She had simply been there, in the way that Fiona was generally present in places where things worth witnessing were happening. She looked at Cole's retreating back, and then at Calloway, and then she walked toward her. They stood together in the corridor without performing the preamble of people who need to establish that they are about to have a meaningful conversation. They just began. "Shindand," Calloway said. "Helmand Province. 2019 to 2021. Fiona's voice was even. "We overlapped by about 4 months." "I know." Fiona looked at her. "You knew who I was this afternoon when you mentioned the FOB. You didn't—" "Mission parameters," Calloway said. It was not an apology. It was information about the constraints she'd been operating within, offered without the expectation that it would be fully satisfying because she understood that it wasn't. Fiona was quiet for a moment. Then she extended her hand, but not in the standard way. She extended it in a grip that had a specific configuration, a particular angle of approach that was used by the units operating out of FOB Shindan for recognition purposes in the field, a thing that had become habitual and stayed habitual, long past the posting it had been developed for. Calloway took it. The grip was returned precisely. "Lashkar Gah," Fiona said. "August 2021. Calloway held still. "You were there. 3rd compound from the east. Pound from—" Fiona said it the way people say coordinates that have a body count attached to them. Carefully, with respect for the weight. "I was attached to the recon team on the outer perimeter. We heard the secondary device go. We didn't know the primary team had anyone." She stopped. 3, Calloway said. "We had 3 left by then." Fiona looked at her. "I heard it was 1 survivor." "It was," Calloway said, and did not elaborate, and Fiona, who had been in enough of those situations to understand the arithmetic, did not ask her to. They stood together for another moment. There was between them the silence of people who have been in adjacent versions of the same dark place, and have each found their way out through their own door, and who understand without discussing it that the doors don't need to match for the place to be shared. "You're going to take the new command," Fiona said. It was not quite a question. "I haven't decided." Fiona looked at her steadily. "The new unit needs someone who's been to every level of what the job requires." She paused. "There aren't many." Calloway was quiet. She looked at the corridor, at the long fluorescent run of it, at the doors with their small windows, at the nursing station where Mason was currently entering data into a system with the focused attention of someone who has recently made a decision about the kind of professional he wants to be. At Holly, who was checking vitals in room 3 with the practiced care of a person who will, Calloway had determined sometime in the last hour, be genuinely excellent at this job in ways that will be invisible to the people above her, until they are not. "FOB Shindand, huh?" Calloway said finally, not to Fiona, or not only to Fiona. Fiona smiled. It was a small smile, the smile of a person who has been right about something they needed to be right about. "Third compound from the east," she said again. Then she turned and walked down the corridor. And that was the end of it, and also the beginning of something else that neither of them would be able to name for several weeks. Every person in that hospital will remember this day for the rest of their careers. If this story landed the way we think it did, share it. Show someone what real service looks like, what it costs, and what it's owed. Subscribe if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments. Did you see the reveal coming? We read everything. We'll see you in the next story. Porter found Calloway at the south entrance at 20:32 hours. She was standing outside in the winter air of Kaiserslautern. No coat, the scrub she'd been wearing for 15 hours, the Ghost Unit 7 armband on her wrist catching the light from the entrance panel. Ranger was sitting beside her. He had not left her side since arriving, with the exception of a second water bowl that Holly had provided, and gave every indication of having no intention of leaving her side in the foreseeable future. Porter stood beside her. He looked at the same things she was looking at. The vehicle bay, the lights of the base perimeter, the dark above the building where the German winter sky had a different quality than the dark above Kandahar. "The package is secure?" he said. "Everything the mission required," she said. "The intelligence from the isolation ward is intact. The chain of custody is clean. No one in the building knows what the actual objective was. No one in the building has the clearance to know," she said, "which is correct." A pause. The cover held. "Until it didn't need to." Porter nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The new unit." It wasn't a question. It wasn't a pitch. It was offered the way things are offered when the person doing the offering understands that the decision belongs entirely to the other person, and they are simply making space for it. Calloway looked at the perimeter lights. She had looked at perimeter lights in a great many places. They had a sameness across latitudes and conflicts. Not comforting exactly, but consistent. The way certain things are consistent that you come to rely on. "It would be a medical Tier 1 unit," Porter said. "Combat-ready, full surgical capability, integrated into direct action teams. You'd command a 12-person element. The mission profile would require everything." He paused. "Every skill set. Not divided. Integrated." She considered this. "Timeline? 6 months to full operational capability. You'd have 3 of those for selection and training." She looked at Ranger. He looked back at her with the patient attention of an animal that has no opinion about timelines, but considerable interest in what his handler decides. "I'll give you an answer before I'm wheels up," she said. Porter looked at her. "When are you wheels up?" "When Ranger's medically cleared for transport." She looked at the dog. 24 hours, maybe 36. Porter almost smiled. It was a very small thing, and it was gone before it fully arrived. "I'll have the preliminary command brief ready," he said, which was not an acknowledgement that she'd said yes, and was not a concession that she hadn't. He walked back inside. She stood in the cold for another few minutes. Ranger leaned slightly against her right leg. It was not a trained behavior. It was the behavior of a dog that has found the person it was looking for and is unwilling to create unnecessary distance. She put her hand on his head once, briefly, and then took it away. The night shift change at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center happened at 2100 hours, as it always did, with the careful passing of charts and the accounting of every patient and the quiet orientation of one team to the work of the next. But the transition on this particular evening had a quality beneath its routine surface, a quality of people carrying something from the day that was not going to fit cleanly into an end-of-shift debrief and was not going to be left in the building when they went home. Holly completed her handoff at 21:14 hours. She stood at the nursing station for a moment afterward, her jacket over her arm, her bag on her shoulder, not yet moving toward the door. She was looking at the notation she'd added to Torres's chart, standard nursing note, post-procedure vitals, medication schedule, and thinking about the fact that the procedure she was noting had been performed by a woman she'd been told to stand clear of, and that if the woman had stood clear of herself, the chart would have had a different kind of notation in it. Mason appeared beside her. He had his notebook in his hand. He had been adding to it since the corridor. "What do we do with today?" he asked. Holly thought about it. "We carry it," she said, "and we do the next thing differently because of it." "That's it?" She looked at the chart. "What else is there?" He thought about this. He looked at his notebook. Then he closed it and put it in his pocket. "I'm going to remember the 47 things," he said. "I'm going to remember that I wrote them down without knowing what they were. And then I'm going to spend the rest of my career making sure I learn to recognize them faster." Holly nodded. This seemed right to her. She put her jacket on and walked toward the exit. At 21:40 hours, the recovery room was quiet. Torres was sleeping. Actual sleep now. The deeper register. The vital signs of a body that had decided it was safe enough to restore itself. Ranger had rearranged himself beside the door, curled with his nose against the threshold, the light from the corridor making a thin line along his flank. The bowl Holly had provided still had water in it. Ivy Calloway sat in the chair she had occupied since the afternoon, except that the cuff was no longer on her left wrist, and she had changed out of the hospital scrubs into her own clothes. Standard issue civilian basewear, dark and without insignia. The armband remained on her right wrist. It would remain there until she put it on a rack in a place she was not thinking about yet. She had her satellite phone in her right hand. She had retrieved it from the locker where she'd stored it at 5:29 a.m. She turned it over once, twice. The weight of it was familiar. She looked at Torres. She thought about Lashkar Gah. She thought about the 3 people who had gone into that compound and the arithmetic that had come out. And she thought about what Fiona had said. "I heard it was one survivor." And she thought about the fact that the one survivor was now sitting in a hospital room in Germany with a satellite phone in her hand and a dog by the door, and that this was not the most impossible configuration the last several years had produced. She turned the phone on. She looked at the screen. She opened a communication window. She typed a code, not a name, not a number, a code, and waited. The response came in 47 seconds. Acknowledged. Standing by. She typed, "Package secure. Mission complete. Request 24-hour delay for asset medical clearance." The response, "Granted. Transport arranged upon confirmation." She closed the window. She put the phone in her jacket pocket. She leaned back in the chair and looked at the ceiling, which was the plain suspended tile ceiling of a hospital recovery room, and was therefore unremarkable, and was therefore exactly what she needed to look at. After a while, Ranger lifted his head from the threshold and looked at her. She made no sound, but he read something from the quality of her stillness and lowered his chin back to the floor, satisfied. The satellite phone vibrated at 22:03 hours. One vibration, the pattern she had programmed for high-priority contact. She answered without speaking. "Ghost 7, the voice said. "Confirm receipt." "Confirmed," she said. "Package secure. There's a development." The voice was unhurried, specific. The voice of a person communicating in conditions that reward precision. "The extraction you facilitated, the intelligence in the isolation ward. We ran preliminary analysis." She waited. "It connects to something larger than the initial brief indicated," the voice said. "There's a second node. Location is being triangulated now." She was quiet for a moment. "That's not in the original mission scope." "No," the voice agreed. "It's not." Another silence. Ranger had lifted his head again. "When?" she said. 72 hours, possibly less." She looked at Ranger's bandaged paw. She looked at Torres's vital signs on the monitor. She looked at the ceiling again. "I'll need Ranger cleared by a military vet first," she said. "Understood. And I'll need the full file on the second node. Being prepared." She ended the call. She put the phone back in her pocket. She sat in the chair in the quiet recovery room and looked at nothing in particular for approximately 40 seconds, which was how long it took for the shape of the next thing to resolve from the surrounding uncertainty into something she could work with. Then she pulled the phone back out and opened a different window. the communication thread with Porter's secured line, and typed 6 words. "I'll take the command. Let's talk." She sent it. She put the phone away. Ranger's tail moved once. He had not been watching the phone. He had been watching her face. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I know." She stood up from the chair. She moved to the window, the one Torres had been facing all afternoon, the one that looked out over the facility vehicle bay, and beyond it, the lights of the perimeter, and beyond those, the dark shape of the German winter landscape. She stood with her feet shoulder-width apart and her hands loose at her sides, and she looked out at all of it. The south vehicle bay at 22:17 hours had 4 vehicles in it, 2 transport vans, an ambulance held on standby, and the black military SUV that had brought Porter from Ramstein Air Base. The SUV's driver had left the vehicle and gone inside at some point in the evening. The vehicle sat unoccupied. Calloway noticed, in the way that people who have trained themselves to notice things that are wrong, that the headlights of a vehicle at the far edge of the vehicle bay were off. This was not unusual. Parking with headlights off is standard. What was unusual was that the vehicle had not been there when she'd stood outside with Porter at 20:32 hours, and she could see from the angle that it was not a facility vehicle, and it had not moved. She noted this with the specific quality of attention that files things rather than acts on them immediately. She noted the model, dark-colored sedan, European, plate partially obscured, and the position which gave it sightlines to the main entrance and the south exit simultaneously. She did not move from the window. The phone vibrated twice in her pocket, the pattern for incoming encrypted message. She pulled it out. The message was from the secure contact address she'd used 11 minutes ago. Vehicle bearing southwest, unattributed surveillance, not ours. Exercise discretion. She read this twice. Then she looked at the vehicle bay again. The sedan had not moved. She typed, "How long?" The response came in 19 seconds. "Unknown. Possibly since your arrival this AM." She lowered the phone. She thought about the 14 hours she had spent in this building, visible to 40-plus personnel, performing functions that did not invite scrutiny from outside the building. She thought about the package in the isolation ward and the intelligence she'd extracted, and the second node that was resolving somewhere in the analysis chain 72 hours from now. She thought about Lashkar Gah and the secondary device and the arithmetic. She looked at Ranger. He was already up. He had been watching her face again, and her face had changed in some way that he understood without needing to classify. She fastened the armband's buckle. She checked her jacket pocket, phone, credentials, nothing extraneous. She looked at Torres's vitals one more time. 94%. Steady. The chart on the monitor was clean and correct, the work of a morning that had happened many hours ago, done by a version of herself that this room had required. She moved to the door. Ranger moved with her, the bandaged paw accepting his weight without complaint, the collar's tags silent because she had taped them at some point in the evening without thinking about it. She put her hand on the door. "Ranger," she said. Her voice was the same as it had been at 5:30 a.m., the same flat register, the same absence of performance, the same quality of a person who has decided what they're going to do and is simply doing it. He looked up at her. "Start again," she said. He went through the door first. The corridor was quiet. The night shift had settled into its rhythms. Holly was gone. Mason was gone. Floyd had gone home 2 hours ago. The nursing station had a different face at it now, someone Calloway had not met, who looked up briefly as she passed, noted the armband, and returned to the intake form they were completing. She walked the length of the corridor to the south exit. She did not look back. She pushed through the door into the winter air and let it close behind her. And for a moment, she stood on the concrete outside the building with Ranger beside her, both of them looking at the vehicle bay. The sedan was still there. The headlights were still off. She stood in the cold and looked at the sedan, and she thought about 72 hours. And she thought about a second node, and she thought about the 12-person element Porter had described. Surgical capability, direct action integration, everything required, not divided but integrated. And she thought about what Fiona had said. There aren't many. There weren't many. There never had been. There were people who had one thing, and people who had another. And very occasionally there were people who had been in enough places under enough conditions to have all of it, and the price of having all of it was always the same price, paid on different days in different currencies, and she had paid it and was going to keep paying it. because that was the arrangement, and the arrangement was not unfair. She had made it. Torres had made it. Ranger had traveled 412 kilometers with a bandaged paw and 2 cracked ribs to deliver an armband to the person it belonged to. The sedan did not move. She pulled out her satellite phone. She opened the communication window. She typed, "Confirm second node timeline and secure transport for 1K9. The response came quickly. "Confirmed, 22:45. Departure. Gate 7. She put the phone away. She looked at the sedan for another 3 seconds. Then she looked at Ranger. "They're not going to make this easy," she said. Ranger looked at the sedan. His ears were fully forward. The fur at his shoulders was perfectly still. She turned and walked toward Gate 7, and Ranger fell in beside her left knee, and the sedan sat in the dark of the vehicle bay with its headlights off. And somewhere in the analysis chain of a building Ivy Calloway had never been to, a second node was resolving from uncertainty into coordinates, and the night was full of things that were about to begin. Real warriors don't advertise. They simply return to work.